She had a voice that could burn through smoke, a face made for rebellion, and a stare that dared the world to blink first. But behind the power chords and psychedelic lights, Grace Slick was fighting something darker than the decade she defined. She wasn't just the queen of Jefferson Airplane, she was its engine, its conscience, and its ticking time bomb. The same woman who sang Feed Your Head to 500,000 dreamers at Woodstock was, behind closed doors, unraveling at the edges. Fame fed her freedom. Freedom fed her demons. And by the time she realized the price of that liberation, the revolution she'd led had already devoured her. So what really happened to the woman who gave a generation its anthem and nearly lost herself to it? Let's go back to where the trip began. Grace Barnett Wing was born in Evanston, Illinois in October 1939, the calm before America's cultural explosion. Her father, Ivan, worked as a banker. Her mother, Virginia, had once sung professionally. Grace grew up surrounded by pianos, radio static, and unspoken tension. Her family moved off in Illinois to Los Angeles to Palo Alto, and she never quite fit anywhere. In interviews decades later, she'd describe her childhood with surgical honesty. It was all so polite, so sterile. Nobody talked about sex, politics, or fear. I couldn't wait to get out. Even as a child, she was drawn to what made people uncomfortable: loud music, bold colors, challenging authority. After graduating from Palo Alto High, Grace attended Finch College in New York City, a finishing school for upper-class girls. But the debutante life bored her. She wanted chaos, noise, something alive. She dabbled in modeling, appeared in fashion ads, and wrote sarcastic captions on her photo proofs, early hints of a rebel sharpening her voice. In 1961, she married Jerry Slick, an aspiring filmmaker and musician. The couple lived in a San Francisco apartment filled with film reels, paintbrushes, and a second-hand guitar. Grace began writing songs mostly for fun until 1965, when the Bay Area became the epicenter of a cultural earthquake. The Beatles had changed everything. The Doors were rising in LA, Dylan was going electric, and San Francisco was ground zero for what would become the psychedelic revolution. The Haight-Ashbury district pulsed with experimentation, LSD, free love, anti-war protests, and a belief that music could actually change people. Grace was drawn in immediately. She joined a local group called the Great Society with her husband Jerry and his brother Darby. They played small clubs, writing songs that reflected the fractured idealism of the moment. One of those songs, White Rabbit, would eventually define her life. It came to her one night after listening to Miles Davis's Sketches of Spain on repeat while tripping on acid. The hypnotic horn lines fused in her mind with the surreal imagery of Alice in Wonderland. In a few hours, she wrote one of the most enduring. Metaphors of the counterculture, a warning wrapped in whimsy. But the Great Society never broke through. In 1966, after Jefferson Airplane singer Sina Anderson left to raise her child, Grace was invited to join the band. She accepted, and within months, her voice turned a promising local act into a generational phenomenon. When Jefferson Airplane released Surrealistic Pillow in 1967, everything changed. Somebody to Love and White Rabbit hit the charts like detonations. Suddenly, Grace Slick was on every radio, every magazine cover. Her contralto voice, haunting, commanding, untamed, became the sound of youth breaking free. Critics called her the dark angel of the summer of love. Yet for all the love and light projected by that phrase, there was something volcanic under the surface. Grace never wanted to be a pop idol. She wanted to be taken seriously as a musician, an artist, a provocateur. While other singers posed with flowers, she spoke bluntly about drugs, war, and sexual hypocrisy. She challenged interviewers. She made jokes that frightened network executives. When the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour asked Jefferson Airplane to tone down their politics, she reportedly told the producer, "If you wanted a choir girl, you should have hired one." That defiance made her iconic, but it also alienated her from the establishment. The FBI kept tabs on her. Concert promoters called her unpredictable. She laughed it off, saying, "Good, that means I'm doing it right." But privately, the cracks were showing. The long nights, the tours, the substances, they all began to blur together. LSD was an escape at first. Then came harder drugs, heavy drinking, and the realization that the peace and love generation wasn't immune to ego and burnout. The band's success only deepened the fractures. Behind the stage chemistry, there were fights over songwriting credit, royalties, and creative control. Grace, often the only woman in the room, had to fight harder to be heard. It took a toll. She'd later admit she drank before most shows. "It made me braver," she said. Until it made me stupid. One infamous concert in the late 60s saw her so intoxicated she forgot the words to her own songs. Another night, she hurled her microphone stand across the stage after a fight with the sound engineer. She became a legend of chaos, the female equivalent of Jim Morrison, both worshipped and feared. Still, there was brilliance in the madness. At Monterey Pop, at Woodstock, she delivered performances that felt otherworldly, channeling anger, wit, and surrender all at once. But as the cameras captured her transcendence, she was quietly slipping into a war with herself. The revolution had a soundtrack, but no safety net. And Grace Slick was living proof that even icons could bleed. By 1969, the dream of the counterculture was dying. The Vietnam War raged on. The Manson murders shattered the illusion of peace. And at Altamont, where Jefferson Airplane performed before violence broke out, Grace saw the moment she'd later describe as the end of the innocence. She watched Hell's Angels beat concertgoers as Mick Jagger tried to calm a mob. She saw the same crowd that once chanted love erupt into fear, and she knew it was over. The irony was brutal. Grace had spent years preaching consciousness, and now she was watching that consciousness collapse under its own weight. Then came the story that would define her myth, the Nixon White House incident. In April 1971, Grace was invited to a reunion event at the White House for Princeton alumni. She had briefly attended Finch College, but her then-boyfriend, a Princeton graduate, added her name to the list. Grace saw an opportunity, or maybe just a dare. She planned to bring Abby Hoffman, the anti-war activist, as her guest, and in her purse she carried a small vial of LSD. Her idea, half joke, half statement, was to spike President Nixon's tea. The plan never got that far. Security recognized her name at the gate. One guard reportedly said, "We know who you are and you're not coming in." She laughed later, but it marked a turning point. The radical icon was now persona non grata, the rebel barred from her own revolution. And underneath the laughter, something inside her cracked. Her marriage to Jerry Slick dissolved. Relationships within the band became tangled and tense. Fame had given her a platform, but taken away peace. The 60s were gone. The dream was gone. And for Grace Slick, the question became, what do you do when the world you built collapses overnight? The answer, for a while, was drink. The 1970s began not with revolution, but with regret. Jefferson Airplane splintered. Members drifted into solo projects or spin-offs. Grace found herself in the ruins of an era she had helped define, older, disillusioned, but still searching for meaning. In 1974, she and bandmate Paul Kantner formed Jefferson Starship. It was slicker, poppier, and aimed squarely at mainstream success. The critics sneered. The fans adapted. But Grace herself seemed caught between two worlds, the fearless anarchist of the 60s and the reluctant celebrity of the 70s. The new fame didn't heal her. It hollowed her out. Touring brought isolation, endless parties, and oceans of alcohol. Grace's drinking grew legendary and dangerous. She could be witty one moment and volcanic the next. Bandmates tiptoed around her temper. In 1978, during a European tour, it all imploded. At a concert in Hamburg, she took the stage visibly drunk. What started as banter turned into insults. She mocked the German crowd, made cruel jokes, and provoked a near riot. The show collapsed into chaos. Grace was arrested and spent the night in jail. The next morning, she stared at herself in the mirror of the police station bathroom, swollen eyes, smeared eyeliner, shaking hands. This wasn't the woman who sang to 500,000 dreamers at Woodstock. This was the wreckage of that dream. It was her rock bottom. After returning to the U.S., she quit the band, checked into rehab, and began the painful process of sobriety. She later said, "I had to relearn everything, how to talk, how to eat, how to be quiet." For the first time in over a decade, there was silence in her life. Grace tried to live privately, but fame doesn't vanish quietly. Reporters kept calling, fans still sent letters. When she did re-emerge in the early 80s, it was different. Jefferson Starship, now renamed Starship, had become pure radio pop. "We built this city, and nothing's gonna stop us now" topped the charts. Ironically, Grace Slick, the voice of rebellion, was now singing corporate anthems for the very world she once mocked. She was nearly 50. MTV played her videos next to Madonna's and Duran Duran's. The dissonance wasn't lost on her. She told Rolling Stone, "Old people don't belong on rock stages. When I watch myself, I feel like my grandmother in leather pants." So in 1989, she did the unthinkable. She retired. No encore, no farewell tour, just a quiet exit. For someone who'd once courted chaos, peace felt radical. She began painting surreal, dreamlike portraits of rock icons and mythic creatures. She painted the White Rabbit, Hendrix, Morrison, even herself fragmented, floating between time. Her art sold steadily, collected by fans who wanted a piece of the woman who'd once told them to question everything. Through her artwork, she found a new rhythm, one not dictated by tours or charts. She stayed sober, lived quietly in Malibu, and gave interviews that stripped away the romanticism around the 60s. People think it was magic, she said. It was messy, but it mattered. She didn't hide her past. She owned it. Every mistake, every relapse, every heartbreak. She spoke openly about how fame magnifies weakness and how survival often requires disappearing, and she survived. In the 2000s, Grace became a cult icon again, not for what she did, but for what she endured. Younger artists cited her as inspiration. She appeared briefly at Jefferson Airplane reunions, always the sharpest mind in the room, still laced with sarcasm. She once joked, "I was lucky. I got famous before everyone had cameras in their pockets." The decades softened her, but didn't tame her. She remained brutally honest about politics, fame, aging. When asked if she missed performing, she said, "No, I did it already." Why repeat it? That refusal to cling to the past may be the most radical act of all. Because in the mythology of the 60s, everyone wants the explosion, the fame, the freedom, the chaos. Few want the aftermath. Grace Slick lived the aftermath and turned it into art. Today, when you hear White Rabbit on a movie soundtrack or a streaming playlist, it still feels dangerous. That voice, half lullaby, half warning, still cuts through decades of imitation. But listen closer, and you'll hear something else. Survival. Grace Slick's story isn't one of tragedy. It's one of transformation. She lived through the height of rock's madness, fell into its deepest shadows, and crawled out alive, scarred, sober, and self-aware. Her legacy isn't just rebellion, it's endurance. The woman who once said, "Feed your head," spent the rest of her life feeding her soul instead. And maybe that's the real untold story, that sometimes the greatest rebellion isn't against the system. It's against the chaos within yourself. If stories like this remind you of what fame costs and how few truly survive it, don't just remember the legend. Remember the person behind it. Because somewhere, in a quiet California studio, Grace Slick is still painting, still reinventing, still alive, proof that even the wildest voices can find peace when the music finally fades.